Well, hello everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of Facebook Live at the International Myeloma Foundation. My name is Dr. Joseph McHale, or Dr. Joe for short. I have the privilege of serving as the Chief Medical Officer of the International Myeloma Foundation. And with me, as you're going to see in a few moments, are my homies, as I've called them, my marvelous friends and colleagues who are support group leaders who have come with marvelous patient voices to share with us in the excitement of the American Society of Hematology annual meeting. So ASH, as we call it, has an annual meeting every December. We're here in beautiful, well, not sunny anymore because the sun is set, but it has been sunny, San Diego, where 28,000 people in person and another 4,000 individuals online have been soaking up the science of hematology over the last few days. Of all of the areas of science of hematology, obviously the most exciting is multiple myeloma, and so we're obviously going to be focusing a little bit in multiple myeloma. So our plan over the next half an hour is to do the following. I'm going to give you a quick overview of really the highlights of some key things that have come out over the last several days, and then each of our support group leaders are going to ask a question of me. We have several that are here in person, some that are virtual online, and then we will be able to take your questions. So start sending in your questions right away, especially if you happen to be down the street. A little shout out to our San Diego support group that happened to be online with us today. As well as the tens of thousands of you who are listening to me as we speak. The International Myeloma Foundation for 33 years has been committed to every single patient on this planet with multiple myeloma, and we've done everything in our power to seek a cure for this disease, and while doing so, support patients and their care partners through that journey. And so having a combination of these great friends with me tonight makes me very happy, because typically you're stuck with listening to Dr. Joe for these Facebook Lives, and so now you'll hear the voices of these amazing patients. So as I mentioned, this is really the premier myeloma and blood cancer and blood disease meeting that is held annually, and we had over 8,000 abstracts submitted. That means 8,000 separate projects in hematology, and over 1,000 of them, almost 1,200 of them, were related to multiple myeloma. And I'm going to walk you through all 1,200 of them this evening. I'm just going to give you the quick highlights, and I'll put them into 5 major categories. Category number 1 is frontline or early therapy. And this is probably the most remarkable phenomenon that we've had here at ASH, which is that we had 2 really extraordinary abstracts in frontline therapy. One of them was during what we call the plenary session, where the very top 6 out of those 8,000 are selected. And that abstract looked at using 4 drugs instead of our historical 3 drugs in frontline therapy before patients go to transplant, with isatuximab, carfilzomib, lenalidomide, and dexamethasone. And the bottom line was that we're seeing over and over again that 4 drugs have been working more effectively than 3 drugs. And tomorrow morning, the last abstract session of the meeting is what we call late-breaking abstracts, abstracts where we just got in the data recently, and indeed we have another 4 versus 3, in this case DVRD, or daratumumab, bortezomib, Revlimid, dexamethasone, or Darzalex, Velcade, Revlimid, dexamethasone, versus just Velcade, Revlimid, and dexamethasone, showing that 4 again is better than 3. So those are the 2 abstracts we're going to hear the most about coming out of this meeting, and it really is remarkable. We're seeing literally over 90-95% of patients getting into a very deep response with these kinds of strategies. Area number 2 is relapsed myeloma, and here we had unbelievable amounts of work, and I'll focus our thinking in 2 major areas. One is in CAR T-cell therapy, and one are in bispecific antibodies.
Can you hold the mic closer to your mouth? Sorry.
Oh, yeah, because people really do need to hear me. All right. In CAR T-cell therapy, this is, of course, a strategy where we take T-cells out of you. T-cells are a form of cell that live in your body that are kind of like soldiers that can be trained. and we take these T cells out and we manufacture them in such a way that they can recognize someone's myeloma, and we actually multiply them in the lab, and then these Rambo soldier cells that are ready to go after myeloma get put back into patients. And we've already had CAR T-cell therapy in myeloma for a few years. We have 2 products that are approved. But here at the meeting, we saw all sorts of new developments in CAR T-cell therapy. Can we use them earlier? Can we find better ways to produce them more quickly so we don't have to wait a long time for that manufacturing? And we really had one of the first studies that looked at what we call allo CAR T, which is instead of taking T cells out of a patient, manufacturing and giving them back, we actually just make CAR Ts in the lab based on healthy donors that have given their own T cells. So someday I want to be able to buy CAR Ts from Costco and be able to deliver them to my patients. Joking aside, obviously it's a serious matter, but it is really impressive when you think of that kind of technology. Bispecific antibodies are the same concept, but instead of taking the T cells out of a patient, we give a patient a drug that has 2 arms. One arm grabs onto their tumor, the other arm grabs onto that T cell and engages it, activates it, so the T cell can destroy the myeloma. And again, we have 3 approved bispecific antibodies in myeloma, but wow, we have another dozen that are being developed, ones that have different targets on the myeloma cells. We have even something called a tri-specific that we're going to talk a little bit more a bit later. And we've also learned a lot more about how we can use them more effectively. How can we reduce the side effects? How can we reduce the infections that come after? Because unfortunately, although these drugs are so very effective, we can still see a lot of very significant infections. So frontline therapy, relapse therapy. Number 3 have been what I call real world data. What do I mean by that is there's a lot of abstracts this year helping us appreciate, sometimes we do great clinical trials and a drug or a strategy looks really impressive, but then when it gets into the real world, it may not be as effective. And this is one of the strategies of the IMF, to find ways to better those outcomes in the real world. How is it that we're using these drugs in patients that were not on the clinical trial, but want to have the benefits that we saw in the clinical trial? Area number 4 is what we call health equity. And as you know, the IMF is deeply committed to the benefit of all therapies to all patients. We've created our Empower program to empower patients and communities to change the course of myeloma, because a black man or a black woman diagnosed with myeloma today will live half as long as the same aged white man or white woman with myeloma, and we know that's unacceptable. So there have been some fantastic work here looking at how can we reduce that disparity. One particular abstract I really enjoyed was called The Black Point of View, where someone had looked at the reaction of individuals to clinical trials and saying, do we want to participate in clinical trials? What are the barriers to participating in clinical trials? What are the barriers to having communication with your doctor about multiple myeloma? And so the whole world has become more attuned to health equity, and I'm grateful to see that we're really focusing that in multiple myeloma. So we had frontline therapy, we've had relapse therapy, we've had real world data, we've had health equity. At number 5, and maybe my favorite for this group around me, is what I call patient-focused or patient-centric abstracts. As I say all the time, I don't treat myeloma, I treat people. And to see this many abstracts this year focused on the patient experience, looking at quality of life measures, looking at ways to make the experience better, whether it's financial navigation or wearing a little device that helps monitor how your health is doing during a CAR T-cell therapy so you don't have to go into the hospital as much, or maybe my favorite, down with Dex, looking at ways to use less dexamethasone in what we do in multiple myeloma. I know that's a really rough summary of so much amazing work, but this field has evolved immensely. I've had the privilege of being involved in myeloma research and work for over 20 years. I have never seen a year like this year, where we have seen this much advancement in the basic science in the lab, in the clinical trials in the clinic, and indeed out in the community as we seek to deliver great care to our patients. So those are some of the things that you're going to hear a lot about over the next several weeks. Hopefully you've been listening to all these amazing support group leaders, listening to them in the broadcast that they've had, reading their tweets or their posts on X and blogs, and we have been doing everything we can to promote the work that is going on here to better the lives of our patients. So at this point, I'm going to turn to each of our support group leaders and get them to ask a single question, but we're going to start with Robin Toohey, who is going to not actually ask a question, but talk about one very important abstract that we had at the meeting this year.
Okay, well, that was an excellent overview, as always, Dr. Joe. And I just have to say, it's been an honor and a privilege to put another ASH team together consisting of patients, care partners, nurses, all support group leaders from all over the country who just want to learn, to share, to engage, to go back into their local communities and global communities by what we're doing here at ASH, by blogging and tweeting and doing videos and now a Facebook Live. This is so exciting. And I'll let everybody out there know it's draining. These people have been up before the sun comes up, and now obviously the sun is down, and they all are resilient. And I'm so proud of each and every one of them here and virtually. So to have a team that consists of people that can participate at ASH virtually means they don't have to run from one end of a convention center or a hotel to another end or pick which abstracts do I want to go to because I can't get to the other ones. So we divide and conquer. They're at home. They're able to do all these wonderful things. And then we have meetings every day virtually with the virtual leaders, with the in-person leaders, and Teresa Michelli, who's our wonderful nurse that helps us with, Teresa, what do these words mean? Which abstracts do you think that we should go to? And then we have these sessions to talk about I have a question. I didn't quite catch that, Teresa. How does that matter to me? And I know you've had conversations with everyone here, as well as our breakfast working group meetings. I mean, we're up at 6 a.m. and then we sit and we have a working breakfast, and the meetings that we have are fun but productive, and we learn how can we all best work together to get the word out. And so I am Vice President of Support Groups at the International Myeloma Foundation, and I am a care partner and a support group leader for groups in Connecticut and Rhode Island. And I want everyone here to think about geographically who we're representing. So when we do go around and ask our questions, leaders here and the virtual leaders, they're going to be chatting in too. So pay attention to the chat. And who do we want to go to next?
Well, I'm going to ask you about one particular abstract that you wanted to share with us.
Oh, well, oh gosh, one particular is tough because,
Caregiver abstract.
yes. So, near and dear to my heart, and I think this may be the first in myeloma ever. It was a caregiver abstract, and it was a poster, and it was last night, and it was put on. We were really fortunate. We got to the poster hall, and to paint a picture for you, this poster hall looked like you were going to like a big concert. It was packed with people going up and down the hall and the aisles and looking for certain posters. And so when we found the care partner poster and it was put on, the presenters were there. We were able to interview them. We did a nice little video that we're going to put out there. But it talked about, with all of these new therapies that are out there, how the role of the care partner has changed through the years. It's obviously become much more important, but also what is the stress and the anxiety for the care partners? And we heard some information that when you were talking about the monitor, the wearable monitor for home, HBO, home, what is that middle initial stand for? Homebound, help me. Homebound, observation. We don't really remember what it is. but it's being a patient in the home for some of these therapies. And the anxiety seemed like it may go up. But when they found out how well this device works and all the support that they have from the healthcare practitioners at the hospital, their anxiety reduced. So I was thrilled to see a Care Partner oral abstract at ASH.
Excellent. Wow. And just as a wild card here, there was another poster, not provided by a care partner, but actually by a patient. And this is when I suck up to my boss. Because Yelek Beru presented his first ever poster at ASH as he shared his experience. And I may convince him to get into the camera here at some point this evening to share with us what his experience was in going through cytokine release syndrome and going through the process of CAR T-cell therapy. But let's, maybe we'll start over here with Sherry. Is that all right? So, Sherry, you'll have to introduce yourself, and we'll let you fire the first question at us.
Okay. I'm Sherry Baker I lead a support group in Boise, Idaho. And my question for Dr. Joe is, how soon will we be getting CAR T therapies for first, maybe second line relapse, instead of now where it's much more heavily pretreated patients?
Such a great question, Sherry. Go figure that Sherry asks a rock star question. So right now, CAR T-cell therapy is approved when patients have had at least 4 prior lines of therapy, not necessarily even drugs, but separate lines of therapy. But we have 2 wonderful clinical trials that were done using the 2 CAR Ts that we have available in earlier line therapy. One was 1 to 3 prior lines, another was 2 to 4 prior lines. And that information from those clinical trials are now being evaluated by the FDA. We thought at one point we might hear as soon as this week actually about it, but the FDA is taking a little bit more time to review it to make sure it is safe and that it's appropriate. So it is going to be several months yet before we know the answer to that, but I think we all feel that when something is as effective as CAR T-cell therapy, that it'll quite inevitably move up earlier on. Not to mention, lastly, that there are clinical trials. I know even at my site, we've just opened one. We have clinical trials where we are using CAR T-cell therapy right in Frontline, either instead of or randomized against autologous stem cell transplant. So I think that is going to be a very major theme of myeloma in 2024.
Good to know.
Maybe we jump to the other side or we've got the mic here. So how about you, TM? Teresa?
Teresa Maselli. I'm a co-facilitator of the Small Order Boulder group with our friends Jesse Dodd. And I also facilitate a group out of Rochester, Minnesota, where I am, and it's also virtual. I've been a registered nurse for a couple of years, and I am so thankful to be a part of this group and for the IMF allowing us to be together. It fills my heart. So I guess my question takes on a bit to Sherry's question having to do with CAR T and the concept of this fast CAR. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, we are playing the car analogy any way possible, right? Fast cars, slow cars, big cars, small cars. For those who may not be familiar, the word CAR itself stands for chimeric antigen receptor, because when we take those T cells out of a patient, what we're doing is we're basically sticking on the outside of them a receptor that is specific to the myeloma, and so that's why they've been called CARs over time. One of the challenges we have with CARs, with CAR T-cell therapy, is that we take the T-cells out of a patient, and often it can take many, many weeks to put those receptors on the outside of them. So that manufacturing process typically is somewhere between 4 to 8 weeks. Well, there are several that are working on fast CARs, as you call them. One in particular, the first one was in China, and we had an update from that abstract here, where they're really trying to reduce that manufacturing time. Instead of 4 to 8 weeks, not even 4 to 8 days, they're trying to get that manufacturing within a few days. Now, there's still a lot of kinks to work out. There's still some other challenges because we also have to prepare the patient to receive their CAR T. There's another product, the one that I have at my center, where we're trying a vein-to-vein time, as we call it, of 10 days, meaning we take the T cells out of a patient, we do the manufacturing, and within 10 days they're back in the patient. So I think that's going to be a helpful feature going forward. One, because we want to treat people more quickly, and especially some patients that have very heavy burden of disease. We don't want that long delay. Sometimes we have to treat them in that period in between that we call bridging therapy. But it's really exciting, Teresa, to see that that we have the ability to to have fast cars. And thank you for all that you do and all the work you do with us, and the fact that you live in Minnesota, as does my wife. All right, we'll turn it over to you, Mike.
Okay, Michael Tui, I am a 23-year myeloma patient. I co-facilitate a group in Prospect, Connecticut, as well as Warwick, Rhode Island. So Dr. Joe, we've been talking about bispecifics and CAR-Ts. I'm really interested in HPN 217, which seemed really unique to me compared to other trispecifics. Can you explain mechanism of action?
Absolutely. Leave it to Michael to ask the complex question, but I love it. So I don't have 3 arms, so this always becomes tricky. So yeah, okay, so we got 3 arms on. So we described earlier that bispecifics are drugs that they're called bi because they have 2 arms. One arm primarily grabs onto the myeloma cell, the other arm grabs onto that local T cell and engages it. Right now, by the way, it is T cells, but we're doing a lot of work with other cells now. Many of them are called NK or natural killer cells to do the same thing. But that's how bispecifics work now. One of the challenges with bispecifics is as we give this infusion of the drug, it works for a period of time as long as the drug is active, and then it sort of runs out. Like with any drug, it's got a half-life and it goes away, and so then we have to reinfuse. And for a lot of the treatments we give now with bispecifics, we're actually giving them every single week. We're learning to back down a little bit. But so what has been introduced in this tri-specific, now there's a 3rd arm, and this 3rd arm holds on to the normal protein of our blood, something called albumin. And the concept there is basically making the bispecific, by now becoming a tri-specific, making it extended release, meaning that it stays in the circulation longer because it's holding onto the protein in your blood and, if you will, sticking around longer so that we can give that dose and then not have to give the next dose for a long period of time. And so that makes it more convenient for patients, less frequent visits to a hospital. Now, it's really preliminary data. It was just presented today by Dr. Madan, who's a good friend of mine, and it's really marvelous and fascinating scientific work. But like everything else, it takes a little time to go through. But I'm excited as you are about it, Michael, because I would love to see the opportunity for us to be able to use something like that soon so that patients have less frequent infusions. Becky, I think we're turning it to you are we going to pull an online question?
We sure are. We have 6 virtual leaders at home. Excellent. Watching and interacting with us here in the chat. So the first that we're going to go to is Barb Davis. She's a first-time ASH attendee, and she has done absolutely fantastic. She's a support group leader in Stillwater, Minnesota. And her question
the Minnesota theme is carrying.
Yes.
Thank you, Barb.
Her question is, what looks most hopeful, bispecifics, trispecifics, or CAR-T?
Oh.
Well, Barb, I think you may know me, but for those who really know me, I say this all the time. My favorite answer to any question is all of the above. All right? And I say that a little bit jokingly, but truthfully. I think they all hold tremendous promise. And if there's one thing we've learned so far about myeloma is that we want options for patients. And we want to be able to match the right option to be given at the right time to the right patient. And so developing all of these in different ways is going to be helpful. For some patients, they may really want the CAR-T because they want that one and done treatment. It's over with for a period of time that they're off all therapy. Others may not be able to have that more intensive treatment and want it more continuously over time. So for us, I think the hope is that we develop all of them. I think we see pluses and minuses with any kind of treatment, but these are a lot of pluses with these kinds of treatments that I think we're getting better at understanding them, reducing the side effects. I'm interested in other tri-specifics, the one that Michael asked about, the 3rd arm hooked onto albumin. We have some where 2 separate arms actually both hook onto the tumor, and that might even make it more effective. So I would say all of those things are really promising as we look forward. What do we do another online, and then we'll do some of our in-persons here.
Sounds good. So another question comes in from Jessie Dahl. She's a support group leader. She's been asked a few times now, and she's a support group leader from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, as well as a co-lead of the Smolder Boulder group. Her question is, given the findings of iStop-MM psych results, where they found no impact on depression or anxiety for those with MGUS and smoldering myeloma, how do you think that the study sample in Iceland impacts that finding? Anecdotally, it doesn't really seem to fit with what we've seen in the US.
So I didn't get a chance in the overview, and I was going to conclude at the very end that one of the most incredible studies done in myeloma, literally over the last several decades, is the iStop program, the Iceland program that we've had the privilege of being a part of at the IMF, where the STOP is an acronym for Iceland Screens, Treats, or Prevents Multiple Myeloma, where nearly 90,000 patients have had their samples collected to really understand the incidence of MGUS, of smoldering myeloma, of active myeloma, what happens over time if we screen a population. Is it good to screen? Is it not good to screen? And we've had tons of results of this amazing study over the last several days here at ASH. And the short version is that it's not ready for prime time yet, but we are seeing a lot of these potential benefits of screening and intervening earlier on. And that's in Iceland, maybe not as a high risk of group as certain populations that we know are particularly high risk here in the US, in particular the African American population, where myeloma is twice as common. One of the studies that was presented was trying to see, well, what happens if you screen people that are healthy and you tell them that they may have a diagnosis that occurs, or that they do have a diagnosis that really doesn't need to be treated now but maybe in the future. And thankfully it demonstrated that there really was not a lot of psychological stress associated with that. And we take that always with a bit of a grain of salt, because different cultures approach things differently. We know that Iceland was a culture that very much embraced a screening study. There may not be that same full trust within the healthcare system here in the US and in particular populations within the US. But at least it serves to us as a start and an understanding that knowledge typically is a good thing, especially if it's going to help us prevent something that may happen to us later. So the population size, as Jesse mentioned, was huge with Iceland. No one will probably ever be able to reproduce that kind of number. But we are involved with the IMF of trying to do similar, much smaller scale screening studies here in the US, where some of those things will be evaluated and hopefully understand things better.
I'm Linda Hugolay from the Chattanooga, Tennessee support group, and I'm going to play off some of the other questions, Dr. Joe, about as we move CAR-T and some of these other things maybe more frontline. Do you see autologous stem cell transplants just going away in the next 5 years?
Oh, you asked the question that if I answer it one way, all the transplanters will hate me. I think if I were to get Dr. Joe's crystal ball out, not that I have one, I do think we will quite likely be doing less transplants in certain capacities. CAR-T may replace it to a certain degree. But I'm also aware of the fact that in a disease that we're not fully curing right now, I don't like to take any option off the table. We know that transplant is really at a benefit for a number of patients. So time will tell as we go through. You know, I remind my transplant colleagues that they even had to change their name. You know, the society used to be the American Society of Bone Marrow Transplant, or ASBMT. Now they changed their name to the American Society of Transplant and Cellular Therapy, or ASTCT, because they wanted to stay ahead of the game. So I do think that we will definitely see more CAR T-cell therapy and brought up earlier. I just don't want to completely remove transplant yet, because it still has some benefits.
And obviously, I mean, a transplant is maybe a fourth of the cost of CAR-T as well.
Right, and so it also depends what jurisdiction we're in, absolutely. And in many countries where it's still going to be a while to get CAR T-cell therapy, that's an important consideration. Or I would turn to you. Oh, yes.
Oh, Lord.
Yeah, bring it up close to your mouth. There you go.
All right. So my name is Odie Gilbert. I am a co-leader for the Hagerstown, Maryland, Myeloma Misfits, the Mason-Dixon line, Myeloma Misfits. This is my first time here at ASH. I was diagnosed with multiple myeloma in 2017, the day after Christmas. I've never reached remission. So here at ASH, it's been overwhelming with good stuff, information. Knowing that it affects African Americans due to one myeloma, my question to you is sort of piggybacking off of Linda's, the stem cells. Can you tell us the difference between stem cells and CAR-T and pros and cons or benefits of it.
Absolutely. So we described a little bit earlier that CAR T-cell therapy, where we take T-cells out of a patient, we kind of manufacture them in such a way that we can give them back to attack their myeloma. Stem cell transplant is an entirely different concept. There's one bit of it that is similar in that we do collect cells out of a patient. But the point of that collection is not to train those cells to fight, but is to allow those cells to grow a new bone marrow. So what do I mean by that? Well, the analogy I always use is, imagine if I have a lawn that's got a lot of weeds in it, and I want to get rid of the weeds. One way to get rid of the weeds is to light a match and burn the lawn. Very effective, but it gets rid of all the good grass. But I'm willing to do that if I have seeds in the garage where I can take out those seeds and grow a new lawn. So with transplant, in a sense, we take stem cells out of a patient, or these are cells that live in our bone marrow that are kind of like seeds that have the capacity to grow a new bone marrow. And we take them out and put them in the freezer, not the garage, we put them in the freezer. Right. And then we give someone a big dose of chemotherapy, kind of like burning the lawn. And it's typically just one dose of chemo. But that dose is really designed to get rid of those bits of myeloma that are stuck in the bone marrow that really need to be scrubbed out. But by doing that, we also knock out a lot of the good bone marrow. So by having those stem cells or seeds to put back in, or actually we just put them in the blood, they're so smart they find their way back into the bone marrow, and that allows the body then to regenerate the bone marrow. And so we know it's not a curative process, just like CAR T isn't curative, but it can very much help patients, as we know over the last many years we've been using it. Carrie. Hi, Carrie.
Carrie Hellman. I co-lead the Mason-Dixon line Myeloma Misfits. You mentioned the emphasis on BEI at ASH this year. With the diversity, with some of the abstracts that we went to, that we heard on under the DEI umbrella, they were very clear about the ethnicity breakdown of the participants. Is that going to be more popular across the board in studies and test trials that aren't necessarily diversity related, but just in general?
Such a great question, Carrie. I'm so glad you asked that. And the short answer is yes. And we've been, and the IMF have been one of the organizations pushing very strong to do this. That typically when we do a clinical trial, it gets reported to a place like ASH. You see that classic slide they call baseline demographics. They tell you about the age of the patient, the gender perhaps, what their stage of myeloma may be. Do they have high-risk myeloma or do they not have high-risk myeloma? Sometimes which country they're associated with. And we've now been saying that we really have to include race and ethnicity there. Because race matters in myeloma. Yeah. It matters, as we mentioned, in survival, in access to therapies, in delayed diagnosis that I know that Oya could speak to. And so it is something that there has been pressure from many organizations, including the FDA, that really this should be the standard. And it should be the standard so that we can know what the breakdown was, and so that someone, when they hear the results of a trial, they can look at it and say, is this applicable to me? Right? It goes back to one of the major themes of this whole meeting, which is real world versus clinical trial. And what happened in the clinical trial, can that be applicable to me? And there are actually some very interesting studies here showing differential outcomes based on race and ethnicity. In some situations where patients would do better or do worse based on the intervention. So I think that's absolutely fundamental and has been something hopefully we're going to see a lot more of over the coming years. All right, I know time's just flying by, but we've got some great other questions online. Let's take those.
It sure is. And I also wanted to shout out that the San Diego support group has 40 members of their group currently doing it. And we wanted to call them out, so thank you all. So Jill Zitzwitz, another one of our virtual leaders from Massachusetts, currently attending ASH virtually, has asked, what do you think is the most exciting science in the pipeline to address the current reality that CAR T just doesn't work for some myeloma patients?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question, Jill. I think one of the most humbling things about being involved in the myeloma world and being a myeloma doctor is that although we've made huge progress, we look at what myeloma was 20, 25 years ago compared to where it is now, even where we were 5 years ago and where it is now, is so wonderful. But the reality is that's not every patient. There are still sometimes high risk, sometimes not high risk, but there are still some patients with myeloma that even the best of our current treatments just aren't enough. And so lots of things are being looked at to try and help us understand that. And I do think that this is part of the research agenda of the IMF, for example, and the Black Swan Research Initiative, where we try and get a large fraction of patients into MRD or minimal residual disease negativity, where we can't measure the disease anymore. But for those who don't get there, we need a different strategy.
Right.
And that strategy may be bringing that CAR T earlier, or doing CAR T cell therapy followed by a bispecific. We're starting to see some of that work together, or even combining some of these drugs together. One of the things we saw here at ASH was a lot of bispecifics being combined with other drugs. I always, as I say, am humbled by some of the very aggressive forms of myeloma, but that is really top of mind as we look at this. As the fraction of patients who get a deep response goes higher and higher, that fraction is smaller and smaller, but it is still such a critical fraction.
Absolutely. Our friend Jack Aiello has a question.
I'm nervous.
Jack is from the San Francisco Bay Area, longtime myeloma patient and support group leader. When will we have personalized treatment for myeloma?
Jack, you always ask the great questions, brother. Well said. Let me put it 2 ways. Way number one, it should be personalized now. Every patient should be treated as an individual human being. Every care provider should be talking to that patient and, most importantly, listening to that patient to treat them as individual and not just treat them as a disease. And so in one capacity, the human dimension of personalized medicine should be present now, and we have promoted this concept so importantly. But in terms of looking ahead to more ways to be personalized, I think with all of these newer options, we are going in that way. We could argue that CAR T cell therapy is highly personalized because we're taking someone's own T cells and doing that manufacturing. I think one of the things that are going to help us as we understand the basic science behind myeloma, as we measure what we're now calling high-risk features, I think that's going to become more sophisticated. And one area, Jack, that I really think is going to be more personalized, that is going to help with time, is that we're developing better tools to measure someone's own immune system, to understand how their immune system is working. And by doing some basic tests, we can say, oh, your immune system's going to keep the myeloma in check or not keep the myeloma in check. So this is not something where we're going to flip a switch and all of a sudden tomorrow it's absolutely personalized. But each of these things are making it more and more individualized, at least, so that we don't just blanket treat everybody in the same way.
Great, I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Let's finish those up.
The next one is from Adrienne Moore, one of our newer support group leaders from Bloomington, Illinois, first timer to ASH virtually. Her question is, as someone who was diagnosed at the age of 42 with fractured T5 caused by myeloma, when will there be ways to detect myeloma before it causes this type of significant damage?
It's always so hard to hear about that kind of damage early on, especially in someone so young as 42. And I think the iStop study that I mentioned is going to shed a lot of light into this. One of the things we've learned is that the average myeloma patient actually sees their primary care doctor 3 times with signs and symptoms consistent with myeloma before the diagnosis is made. That's even longer in patients who are African American or Hispanic American. And part of our Empower program is to try and shorten that. But even beyond that, the question is, should we be screening people? Should we start looking at whether it's at a certain age, based on gender, based on ethnicity? We're not quite there for prime time. But I'm going to predict that we are going to get there. I think there will become a time where we're going to start looking earlier on. This is really a greater phenomenon in cancer. The word that we're often using is intercepting cancer early on before it causes more damage. You know, we screen with colonoscopies, we screen with mammograms, and they're very effective to a certain degree. But as our mammograms are getting more sophisticated, we are picking up more cases earlier on, as our colonoscopies are becoming more sophisticated. And we're now developing incredible tests in myeloma, mass spectrometry, and others that can detect tiny amounts of disease. And there are a lot of things that need to be sorted out, but I really do believe that we are going to be moving in that right. And where I see it in particular is so much of the work that we do, the I and IMF, internationally speaking, is when places don't have that ability to do those tests. It's really sad to see how often patients are diagnosed much later in the disease course. Michael, Robin, and I attended a meeting for myeloma in Jamaica where the other two speakers were surgeons. I never go to a myeloma conference where the speakers are surgeons. And it was because the surgeons, the neurosurgeons, and orthopedic surgeons are very often involved in myeloma cases because it's so advanced by the time we get there.
And then I guess the last question is from a viewer, and it's particularly interesting to me as I helped to co-facilitate the Living Well with High-Risk Myeloma support group. So this question is it possible to include plasma cell leukemia and or high-risk patients in more studies? And if not, how do these patients get access to these newer therapies?
Thank you for that great question. And the quick answer is yes. In fact, there's such an appetite in the myeloma community to more better define high-risk disease and to ensure that we are as inclusive as possible. And really, it's an aspect of DEI, of course, but of making sure that, again, going back to clinical trial versus real world, that we try to build our trials in a way that is much more inclusive. And so we're starting now to see more trials that are including plasma cell leukemia, high-risk disease, some that are even that are directed almost exclusively to that group because it's historically not been included. And so that is very, very important because we know as our tests get better and as we're more sophisticated, we can detect these things earlier on. So I think we are going to see a lot more of that kind of inclusion. Well, it's hard to believe our time's gone. We planned a half an hour, we went 40 minutes. But we want to thank everybody for joining us here. And we're up close and personal with Dr. Joe. And so I just want to take one last moment to thank everybody in this room who's participated in this extraordinary ASH meeting. And it's patients like these that motivate doctors like us to do what we do, and we pray that we can do more for patients. And the voices that you've heard here tonight, the stories that you've heard here tonight are the ones that are going to ultimately lead to the cure, and we believe that, of multiple myeloma. If you want to learn more, feel free always to go to the IMF website of myeloma.org. Obviously, if you're joining us on Facebook, you know our Facebook page as well. Reach out to us. We have an info line. We have a very active website. We always want to help in any way that we can. And as we close off this incredible Facebook Live together, I want to say that all of us, exhausted as we may be, are going to leave San Diego with renewed hope that we know that this disease, terrible as it may be, is being taken down step by step by the kind of work that was presented here this week. So this is Dr. Joe signing off. Thank you everyone for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks very much.